In this video, I will be introducing Kuhn. I will be talking about what question he's asking and what philosophy of science problem he's identifying. So what characterizes his approach is that he was a historian of science. So he looked at the history of science in order to answer some key questions such as how do scientific theories actually develop over time? Do they improve cumulatively? Do they sort of build on top of each other in practice? And is scientific truth or objectivity ever completely achieved? So again, he was trying to answer those questions by looking at the actual history of science. And in that sense, we can contrast it to Guber's more philosophical perspective, who's just sort of thinking more out of principle and considering what science is and what can it do considering the challenge it faces. So this is the then also sociological perspective Kuhn is taking, because he's looking at the practice of collectives of researchers who together and in competition and cooperation try to improve on science. How does that actually happen? And these are then some of the key concepts that we'll get a grasp of throughout the next videos and live session. This is just to highlight that this Kuhn text that we're reading an extract from, a chapter from, this is really one of the most cited social science research of all time, of all social sciences. So these numbers are from 2016, so they're a little bit old, but you might recognize the name Porter and Karl Marx and Maslow and some other, maybe you know some of the other people on there. But this is just really to highlight that it's not just in business administration or in sort of a particular subset of the social sciences or even the general sciences that this is interesting. This is something that goes across and abroad a range of different fields and has been of interest to these many different disciplines. Key question that he's really trying to get to is, how does science and scientific explanation actually evolve? And a metaphor we can consider here is that either it's science and scientific theories are accumulating like when you build a Lego tower. So this is then the first theory, and then you build another one, and then on top of this one you build the next, etc., etc. And in the end you might have a big, beautiful theoretical explanation of how the world actually works, brick by brick in a very linear fashion. That's one perspective on how science develops over time. Kuhn's book, which is called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which then gives an indication of that he has a different take. So he focuses on the revolutions that happens from time to time. That sometimes the tower is destroyed, so the Lego tower that we're building, and we have to start from scratch. So science is not, that's the position that Kuhn is arguing for, science is not one long accumulation of just building on top of former knowledge. And this then also relates to the question, is there actually an external objective truth that we're trying to capture? Is there something out there that we can then imitate and copy and then we're just trying to uncover, or is there something else going on? So it's a meta level, so it's an abstract perspective on what theories are, what science is, and what we're actually doing in research. And just again to highlight and to emphasize the position that he's then arguing against. We have to remember that this book was written in 1962. It's quite a while ago. And a general, sort of a little bit simplified, but a general textbook conception before Kuhn, this was literally what was written in textbooks, was that theories were directly compared to the world, to observations, and there are facts, so to speak, that we can rely on. The Philosophy of Science book chapter, that's also part of the curriculum, also talks about this on page 80. So theory corresponds to the world. That's also an essence of positivism that Guber talks about. So when a theory is true, this is then a direct reflection of how stuff actually works in the world. And an implication of this then is also then theories accumulate, because if the theory you're building on is true, well, then the next one has to take that, has to build on that. And theories are tested deductively. That's the approach that characterizes science. So this was quite literally the textbook conception that Kuhn was then trying to argue against, based on his read of how different sciences, different scientific fields have developed over time. So he's arguing against this linear Lego metaphor where scientific development is just rational and cumulative, brick by brick. And a way of trying to make sense of this, or to try to illustrate Kuhn's skepticism, is to consider this question. well, if a better theory is presented, well, it should be accepted, right? And this is positivism's take on science, that it's accumulative, that true theories represent how the world actually works. So if a better theory is presented, we are in a rational scientific community, we should accept this, right? And a counter example to this is quite famous, and in this year maybe also fitting, that it has something to do with hand washing. So in the middle of the 19th century, there was a doctor called Semmelweis who was in charge of a maternity ward where women go to give birth. Oh, that's what they did there. They went there to give birth and get help from doctors like Semmelweis. And what we see is here on the y-axis we have the monthly mortality rate. So this is the number of mothers who die due to puerperal fever after or while they were giving birth. And as you can see in some of these months, this was really quite terrible and terrifying, absolutely terrifying numbers. A very large proportion of mothers died in this process. I mean, also in the 40s, there were also months where it really was fantastic. But generally speaking, the average really is quite bad. And then in 47, Semmelweis makes a change in his unit. He introduces hand washing. So whenever a doctor has just dealt with a corpse, which or actually often was the problem, they went straight from dealing with someone who just died to trying to help deliver a baby. Whenever they had to get in close contact with a mother and be involved in a birth, they had to wash their hands. Very, very simple suggestion that was being made there, but remember, this was the 19th century, and people just weren't aware of this. This is not a randomized control trial, we have to remember, because this is the same unit where he makes this change. But it's still quite noticeable that after he introduces hand washing, we have a lot of months, what is it here, 15 or something, that are pictured here, where the mortality rate is a lot lower. These are big, big differences that we are talking about. But, and this is then the key thing that Kuhn would then he could then use this example to say, well, there was clearly something going on here which was effective. We're talking about a construct that is very easy to define. Either you're alive or you're dead. It turns out by introducing hand washing, we could reduce the mortality rate substantially. But other doctors in his local community and also sort of on a wider national and global basis did not accept his explanation. They were sure that something else had happened. Maybe Semmelweis had just become a better doctor, or maybe he was getting different patients, or whatever other sort of confounding reasons one could imagine. So this is a situation where there was, and science reveals plenty of these examples, where one could deliver a clearly better explanation, but it wasn't immediately accepted by the scientific community. A key reason here was probably that he had no theory to explain this. He literally had no clue about why this was the case. He could just see that if we wash our hands, we see fewer deaths. There are probably a couple of reasons for why there was this resistance. One element is simple confirmation bias. This did not fit in the worldview of the doctors. A related element is probably also that he's clearly putting the blame on the doctors who are not able to do something as simple as wash their hands. So taking on that responsibility and being responsible for all these mortalities that we see before the introduction of hand washing is of course also quite devastating to have to acknowledge as a doctor. So there are probably multiple reasons, but in any case, the clearer and better explanation is not accepted. And a challenge was probably that he did not deliver a theory. Actually, if we go back to even in Roman times, before Christ, there was a Roman statesman who said there is some minute creatures which cannot be seen by the eyes that can enter the body through the mouth and then can cause serious disease. This was the first time, as far as we know, anyone ever talked about germs as being a thing. This was really the challenge here. Semmelweis did not know that germs could be these small little particles that can crawl, for instance, from a dead body to the doctor's hand and then contaminate whatever else and get it in touch with. That simply wasn't a terminology. There was no awareness of disease being such a thing that could be on a hand. So there wasn't a paradigm, that's what the word Kuhn would use, There was no sort of basic assumption and a basic understanding of how the world works, which means a paradigm that could help make sense of this, which is then a key reason for why this explanation was rejected for years and years, until someone called Pasteur come along and introduced and framed the germ theory, and just within a couple of decades, or three decades, hand washing was a thing. But it's still an explanation of why. It's still an example of how better explanations are not always accepted. Many other examples could be given, but of course this is sort of quite drastic. So it seems to be the case, and that's at least also the argument that Kuhn is then making, that it doesn't seem to be the case that just because you have a more true explanation, or you have stronger empirical data, which Semmelweis clearly had, or he also had a very simple explanation, it's often also not enough that the majority agrees. I mean, it's not possible when we look at the history of science to say, well, it just needs to be one or all of these factors and then a new theory is accepted. It's a much more messy sociological, psychological process. And that's really the key thing that we have to understand here. Is this is how Kuhn is trying to explain how science and theories develop over time. It's not just about whether it sort of captures how the world actually works in a cumulative way. But we have to understand human psychology and human sociology. And that's what we'll be getting an understanding of. So this is then his take on scientific development, that we are aiming to understand that yes, very often science is cumulative and normal, and we are building bricks on top of each other. But sometimes we are facing an absolute crisis, and whether it's realizing that germs is a thing, or the Earth revolving around the sun rather than the other way around, we have to start completely over and change our paradigm and change the way that we perceive and think of the world. So that's also sort of how we define a paradigm. It is about these fundamental assumptions that members of a scientific community have. The next video will explicitly deal with the concept of paradigm. I'm still trying to present and explain why it is that better theories are not always accepted, and especially the psychological angle of it. Just to make clear, often science is accumulative, often it is deductive, but so most of the time he conceived this is sort of how stuff goes on. But from time to time we have these sort of radical paradigmatic shifts where we have to completely reorient the way that we try to make sense of the world, and this is where we sort of have a revolution where we have to start over again. We'll get more into what a paradigm is and a paradigm changes. Now I want to dive into the psychological process of why is it that we might reject a new theory, and this speaks quite directly to what Kahneman was talking about as well. It's something about how we human beings perceive the world. It's something about the biases that sort of also shapes the way our cognition works, and it's something about sociological norms, which we'll get to as well. So a key concept and a key aim by Kuhn is to emphasize that we quite literally do not see the same when we see the world. Data or the world does not prescribe just one interpretation. We can look at this picture and then see all the different dolphins that are on this picture. I don't know whether there are 11 or something of them, but we can also look at the picture and then maybe see something else. And I'm sure you've seen many of those visual illusions. You can pause the video if you want to sort of find out where the dolphins actually are, whatever else is on this video. Kuhn's point is we don't see the world, we see a processed version of the world. In the metaphorical, to quote him, in the metaphorical no less than the literal use of seeing, interpretation begins where perception ends. What perception leaves for interpretation to complete depends drastically on the nature and amount of prior experience and training. So how we perceive and interpret the world drastically depends on the nature and amount of prior experience and training, very much in line with what Kahneman was also talking about. So I might have a specific scientific sort of training and experience that enables me to see something as this new scientific fact, but others might not have that experience or have a different experience and then see something else. How do we then decide who is true or not? So this is then his point, that we can't just easily shift between these different ways of seeing the world, between these different paradigms. And in the end, theories and different paradigms are incommensurable. They are incomparable. You don't have one single standard that enables you to compare them. We'll also get more back to what that exactly means. So this is just sort of to highlight the same point. We can look at this and then say, is it a duck or is it a rabbit? And well, we can ask Google's algorithm. Google has an AI algorithm that can categorize what an image is. And as you can see, depending on how we rotate the image, it actually says it's a duck or it says it's a rabbit. So this is just a quite literal, let me just rerun it again here, quite literal example of how what we see depends on the angle from which we see it from. Here the object itself is rotating, but in the end it could also be the sort of the human perspective that is rotating depending on the prior amount of training experience we have. So again, the point is that we literally do not see the same. If two people stand in the same place and gaze in the same direction, we must conclude that they receive close to similar stimuli. They see close to the same thing, but people do not see stimuli. So it's not just about us sort of having our heads tilted in a slightly different angle. They have sensations, and we can then interpret these sensations in two different ways. And it's because the sensations will not per se be the same thing. Much neural processing takes place between the receipt of stimulus and the awareness of a sensation. And whatever we perceive in the world is in part conditioned by education. So whatever education and prior training we have helps shape to see, now this is just a simple example, whether something is a rabbit or duck, but imagine we're looking at scientific data or phenomena out in the world. The point here would be to say, we can't just say, well, this is what everyone should see, irrespective of their training, because Kuhn's point is that whatever training one has conditions one's to see things in different way. Of course, he's also saying you can't make up any kind of interpretation. If you can't distinguish a wolf from a duck, you won't survive. Sorry, from a dog. So, I mean, it's not saying that anything goes, but in situations where one might be uncertain, he's saying there is no clear absolute standard to refer to know what it is we're looking at. Notice also we make an observation. We don't have it as such. And he's also going to physics to make some illustrations. For instance, here he's saying we do not see electrons, but rather that tracks or else bubbles of vapor in a cloud chamber. This is actually then again what we're looking at here. We're seeing an electron somewhere out here, and then we're seeing some other particles in the kind of image or whatever we want to call it that we're seeing here. And yeah, Einstein and Bohr, they actually disagreed on what they saw, but they would probably be better at understanding what's going on than me, the confused person illustrated here in the middle, because I sort of have a sense of it, but I don't have the training and education to really understand what's going on in this picture. We don't see the electrons as such. We need to sort of interpret and translate whatever we see into constructs that can make sense to us, constructs that we've gained from education and training, and different educations and different trainings might lead us to create slightly different kinds of constructs, whether it's physics or it's unemployment or innovation or strategy or whatever concept we are dealing with. So again, in the metaphorical, no less than the literal use of seeing, interpretation begins where perception ends. What we perceive, what we see in the world depends drastically on the nature and amount of prior experience and training. What we see depends in part on what we believe, and facts are never just facts. They're embedded within a paradigm. So this is not a fact of an electron circling around a particle. It also starts with some paradigmatic assumptions about what we see in the world. And as also indicated just before, we don't see motivation and the efficient market hypothesis, productivity, firm performance, unemployment, etc. But we have some assumptions about how we can get out into the world and measure things, define things, and how we can claim that there are relations between things. But again, prior training and experience has enabled us, to do this, is Kuhn's argument. This is sort of trying to combine Kuhn and Kahneman's language, and an example where someone has exposed economic researchers to some claims. And they've either said, this is a statement made by a mainstream economist or some sort of a bit more unorthodox, a bit more sort of outlier, strange thinker. And it turns out that if if it's not attributed to sort of a mainstream, well-known economist, well, then economists agree with it less. So the same statement will be perceived to have a different truth value depending on who the sender is, which again shouldn't be the case if science was just something abstract and true and corresponding to how the world really works. These are human beings that have biases that influence the way that they see and interpret scientific findings. This is Kuhn's point, and this is then, in that sense, also the same point that Kahneman was making a couple of decades later. The biases we have influences what we see, how we filter the world, how we remember things, and what inferences we draw. I really like this example here that also illustrates the same point. I would claim that if one hadn't seen this before, one would not know what we are looking at here. I can replay the video. I have a better sense of what we're looking at because I've been told and I've read about it that this is a picture, a video, so to speak, of a very distant star system where there's a star in the middle, a sun, so to speak, that is being circled by 7 different planets. This is only a subsection of the video, so we can't see the entire thing, but still. Data is not raw. Data is not just data. We always interpret it on a paradigmatic background. And whether we're looking at planets or whether we're looking at a statistical model, it's never raw as such. We don't see the world as it is in itself. We see the world as framed in the theoretical and methods-based sort of background we have and the constructs we've decided to make. That is Kuhn's point and argument. But of course, this can also then improve over time. Here is the picture we were able to take of Pluto in '94, and this is the one we were able to take in '18, and now we are sending robots to Mars. So of course, our ability to measure stuff improves drastically over time. So Thuobard could improve his measurement by moving the telescope into the basement, but of course he would not able to see Pluto in the same quality as we are able to today. So measurements can continuously improve over time, but we can only make sense of what we see in the concept of the theories that we have. This is also what Kuhn would agree with. Here is a famous quantum physicist, Heisenberg, who said, what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. And that's sort of very much in line with the argument that Kuhn is then trying to make, that we never have this direct access to reality. We don't sort of get stimulus into our vision and brain, that it's just sort of direct image of what the world actually looks like. We shape what we pay attention to, and what we see and how we interpret it and how we perceive it depends drastically on the amount of prior training and experience that we have. So this is sort of the setup of what question was Kuhn asking, how he has done this sociological, historical approach to trying to make sense of how does research actually work, and then trying to give a few examples that illustrate that researchers don't always just immediately change their mind, even if something that seems to be a clearly better explanation comes along. And that is because we can't expect all researchers just to see sort of the same thing out there in the world. Whatever we see depends on our prior experience and training and our definitions and the constructs we've decided to create. And we always sort of see the world through these constructs, through these decisions. And that is why it's difficult to figure out if one group of researchers versus another group of researchers is right in the way they see the world, because, well, they see the world they do because of their background. And Kuhn is then saying there is no absolute standard to compare that to. We'll get much more back to that in some of the next videos and sessions.